there, just to let you know there's been some delays because of some issues with room changes. I'm going to try and perhaps make my talk a little bit shorter because of that. We'll see how we go. I was really hoping to leave some time for question and answer at the end, so if you do end up needing to finish a little bit earlier than you would otherwise, you can feel free to find me afterwards and talk to me directly as well. That's not okay.
We have to just keep going, I guess. And so I'm on behalf of the perfect list, Tami Gadir. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So thank you for being here. And there's actually some, I wasn't expecting this, but there are some interesting links between the talks that were just given now and the things that I'm thinking about and writing about at the moment, which are big picture questions about how we define and practice musical culture, which are constant concerns for people in music studies in various ways. And we have a similarly interdisciplinary field, which is definitely in large part, especially in popular music studies, which is where I'm coming from, hugely embedded in the histories of anthropology and social anthropology and sociology and other similar kind of ethnographically rooted social sciences. So some of the things that were spoken about earlier definitely resonated with me. And I would be really interested to hear, even though this was the abandoned PhD project, about the Berghain aspect of your project, because there's some great work on Berghain at the moment. I don't know if you're aware of it, but it would be good to talk about that afterwards, if you would. Even if you don't want to write about it anymore. So, just to give you a sense of the structure of today's talk, because I know if you're sitting through a day of talks, it can be quite kind of grueling and exhausting if you don't know what to expect. So, if you have an attention span like mine, it can be helpful to know what's coming. So just to give you a sense, I'm just going to give you a little intro to my professional and research trajectory that got me here, very brief. I'm going to talk about the Utopian Myth, which is kind of the underlying starting point of my forthcoming book that I'm doing on dance music culture. And I'm going to sort of, I guess, give you a very sweeping overview of the Utopian myth in dance music culture. I'm going to give you a little case study on the things that I'm doing in terms of historiography of dance music culture. And it kind of sounds strange to think about, this very contemporary field of dance music culture, thinking in terms of history and historiography. But of course, now we have many decades, at the very least, since since what we recognize aesthetically now as dance music culture. We could say sort of starting from New York disco in the 70s, but also you can take it to the other side, to Jamaican dub sound system cultures. And there is a kind of way that these cultural histories have been, they have a particular tone and they have a particular routine, which I've been looking at a little bit in my research and have been very interested in. And we're going to have a little look at the case of New York City, because it's been a very typical starting point for a lot of cultural histories of electronic dance music culture. And then we're going to just look a bit at the perspectives that I've come to based on some field work and interviews and participant observation, as well as general thinking I've been doing. And earlier on, it was more kind of music analytical as well. I come from a classical music background, so I was rooted in these kind of very textual analysis traditions when I first started this sort of interest in dance music a long time ago. But this has kind of, I guess, expanded and evolved in many ways since then. And then I'll talk about some conclusions and talk about the ordinariness of dance music and of musical culture writ large, and of culture writ large. Some of you may recognize the reference "Culture is Ordinary" from Raymond Williams. We can talk a little bit about that as well. And then hopefully we have some time for audience questions and comments. Okay, so just very, very briefly. As I mentioned, classical piano and composition background. So I was a pianist and very, very traditionally rooted training, very classical. I did some jazz piano, but it didn't particularly change the way I thought about music or the musical world very much. I was a classical thinker, one could say. I got interested in DJing at a certain point from both being on dance floors as a clubber, but also being a musician, thinking, this is a very typical musician experience, you know, being there and thinking, oh yeah, I know what this person's doing and I can do it better. Kind of a very, I guess one could say an arrogant perspective, but it was just a sense that I had a kind of itch to try this, whatever it is they were doing to make the music flow for dancers. I wanted to try it myself. So I also started to DJ. And I DJed primarily when I was living in Edinburgh, in this Scottish techno scene. I was part of this techno collective where we would dress up in crazy animal costumes, and it was very festive and carnivalesque. So it was like taking the techno culture, but without just the black clothes and kind of serious looks, making it a little bit silly and frivolous. That was kind of my thinking. And then I started to research dance music for my PhD, and then also for my postdoc. So I've now been doing research on dance music for 8.5 years in total. And I think that this book is probably going to be the culmination of all of that, and then I'm going to move on to something else, because I feel ready to move on to something else. And perhaps separate my recreational life from my working life, which is something that artists have trouble doing, I think. So when we talk about reconsidering rave or rethinking the dance floor, there tend to be two separate narratives that discuss the history of electronic music. So you have the kind of the popular strand, which is electronic dance music and DJ culture on the one hand, and then you frequently have very, very separate or parallel discussions about the histories of electronic art musics and avant-garde and experimentalism on the other hand. And occasionally the two do interlock. Okay, I'm talking about primarily scholarly writing here. But I think that the interlocking happens most effectively in the context where journalists and documentary filmmakers and other non-academic writers deal with the topic. And actually, it's academic writing in which they're mostly treated as distinct, and you know, with their own canon and their own key figures. And this is because the academia has a problem with separating popular and art music cultures, which is an artificial construction, this separation, rooted in scholarly institutions and territorialisms, not really to a large extent in reality. So if you reframe these histories, and you can see many, many overlaps and interactions and interlockings between the people that were experimenting in so-called art music worlds and the people that were playing music on dance floors. They were not entirely separate universes. But interestingly enough, when we talk about electronic dance music culture, you tend to only see the strands kind of starting with this, the popular strand, you know, the disco world in New York City thereafter, and everything thereafter. There are exceptions, but again, they're mainly the journalistic ones, not the scholarly ones. And the reason I think it's important to reconsider rave, as opposed to just think about it in the same way that we continue to think about it, is because from my perspective and my reading of a lot of different literature on dance music culture, there is this utopian myth. And there are certainly legitimate experiences and material realities that lead people to this myth. So it's not grounded in nothing, but it is very much the central narrative and a dominant narrative, and in many ways, when people try to challenge that narrative or say something other than that narrative, they tend to be either ignored or overlooked. The overall story is very, very celebratory. So some of the things that constitute this myth include the notion of the community, the dance floor community, which comes up again and again as a theme in writing on dance music culture. So the fact that it is dancing focused and not focused on superstars on stage. The idea with that is that this somehow makes it inherently more egalitarian. These particular performance aesthetics therefore follow that it's an egalitarian scene. And there's this quotation from Brewster and Broughton, who have written, these are actually DJs and writers, journalists, who have written a range of books on dance music culture, especially DJs, who talk about this notion of togetherness, right? Of participation, equality, communion. The clubbers are the stars, right? So it's not the focus on the person performing the music. you notice also in this quotation that it's very past tense oriented. So there's this sense of there was once this golden age and we no longer have it. We'll come back to that, but this is something to pay attention to because this is another very pervasive narrative that we see. Another aspect of this utopian myth is that because it comes from black and queer and Latino and ethnic other and marginalized groups in the history of the New York disco dance scene, that this therefore means that dance music culture, writ large, is always already more politically alternative and inclusive than other types of music scenes which don't have this history. Okay, so this is another pervasive narrative that we see in almost all the writing that comes through on this particular culture. And this is a quote from Kai Fickencher, who did a big kind of ethnographic project on the underground New York dance music scene in the 90s, 80s and 90s, I think, but he published it very late in 2000. And, you know, he talks about this link to today's music, right? Because even though it's a historical phenomenon, he still sees this lineage into today's music. And it is from the disco environment that the impulses for contemporary dance club concepts emanate, shaped by the overlap of African American and gay expressive cultural styles. So he's kind of combining this idea of the group, the identities of the people involved in the scene with a very particular idea of that they have their own unique aesthetics. Okay, so this is another pervasive aspect of this utopian story. A third very common narrative, which is only, I guess, dealt with by people who are not afraid of losing their jobs in conservative countries, is the drug use in the scene. Very interestingly, you very rarely see American writers addressing the drug use. They're very unwilling to do so, especially in scholarly writing. But British writers do it without any shame. Of course, the British rave culture has a history associated with specifically ecstasy use, but drug use in club culture reaches back way before that, and various kinds of drugs, stimulants, of course, primarily. But the idea, the way that this relates to this utopian mythology is that the drug use, and so the story goes, is that the drug use facilitates this liberating politics. It provides a means of emancipation, or a kind of conduit or channel for finding oneself, self-liberation, but also finding this unity and community. So it's very, very much an integral part of this utopian mythology. And Simon Reynolds is one of the kind of most well-known journalists who's written very unashamedly about drug use in dance music culture, especially in British rave. He's a journalist as well. So, you know, he talks about how ecstasy facilitates this profound experience. He uses terms like, you know, fun fuel, but ego-melting mass communion takes you out of yourself, but merges you with something larger. You know, there's no more I. All this kind of loss of ego is a really big part of this narrative, and the ecstasy, the way that it facilitates empathy to others is supposed to assist this experience. So, you know, and it's a kind of, he calls it a remedy for alienation in an atomized society. It's pretty powerful language. And of course, if you're thinking about where this thinking came from, a lot of it was, of course, linked with the fact that British rave was taking place in the backdrop of Thatcherism, which, you know, had a particular individualistic focus, right? And then, of course, in the utopian myth, we have the ways that music has been discussed as part of this story of liberation, emancipation, you know, a channel for finding oneself, for finding a community. And there are actually a range of authors who address this in various ways. But the general thinking is that the repetitive and primarily electronic nature of the music, this is a really sweeping summary, people say a lot more than this, but that this is in itself a radical departure from other forms of music, and this is embodied as political expression, okay? So that the music, the substance of the music somehow inherently facilitates these kinds of politics, and these are really interesting things that get said about this. So one of the things about disco that was said was that its open-ended repetitions and non-phallic eroticism can be a performative enactment of a world better than this one. And that was Richard Dyer, who was a scholar but actually wrote this in Gay Left, which was a gay periodical, a journalistic periodical in the late 70s. Very frequently quoted in contemporary scholarly work on contemporary dance music culture, which I think is very interesting, given that the scene he was talking about was very specific. Techno is another genre that gets described in terms of how its music facilitates, these kinds of ideas. Techno can warn of our technological future while advocating a DIY techno spirit in confrontation with this future. So they're talking about music doing these things, right? Again, very powerful language. This is Richard Pope talking about the affect of techno music. House music is another one that gets frequently discussed in these terms. House music possesses a funk impulse that frames an open sonic canvas of various cultural influences in a potentially inclusive, democratizing manner. That's a key word that comes up over and over again, right? That this music is somehow democratizing. And by the way, we hear democratizing constantly with reference to digital culture and digitization of art, which I think is also very interesting. And that its amplified, bass-heavy beat unites dancers under one groove. Okay, and this is Hildegonda Reitfeld, who's a well-known senior scholar of dance music culture, based in the UK. And then another one that is kind of very specialized genre, but gets a lot of writing on it because, well, scholarly writers are good at writing about their favorite genres. Psytrance helps participants to be immersed in a social universe that is liminalized, in which spontaneity and indeterminacy are pursued and reanimated in consequential lifestyle and consumer practices. Again, it's like, this is a thing that music can do, is the argument. Very powerful claims, aren't they? People who write these things down really believe in their genre. They really believe in it. And I think that what's very interesting about this is that popular music, the history of popular music writing has been a kind of tension between people, scholar fans writing about their favorite genres but in a scholarly way, and kind of stepping back from themselves and being like, okay, I'm an insider, but is it my job as a scholar to simply use my scholarly writing as a means of inflating the wonderfulness of the scene that I'm involved with? And in dance music, we haven't quite reached that reckoning yet, which I think is fascinating. People are still defending their scene, right, very strongly. But with punk, there's been criticism about how you can't just write about punk as a scholar and say that punk is liberating and politically powerful. You have to say other things too, okay? Because fans of punk will say those things to you. But what is it that we can add? What are our insights? We've done a bit more reading on this. We've stepped back from these kind of fan perspectives. So yeah, all of this here is basically, fancy language as far as I see it for my dance music scene is liberating. And I went into this project when I started my PhD completely buying into this. Like 100%, I was an insider. I believed in the all types of potential for the music that I was interested in. And my goal going into the project was actually to go out there and prove this to people, right? To show how awesome dance music was and doing X and Y. But in being in the scene for a while, I actually, things jumped at me, which didn't quite gel with that perspective, and I think that they're really, really important to acknowledge. And I think the thing that lacks in these celebratory descriptions is that, there's negative sides to fantastic, politically alternative culture too, and we can't make it truly effective unless we also address those negative sides, okay? So what I'm doing is, in a sense, a corrective to this utopian myth. So to give you a little talk about the case of New York City, as I mentioned, it's the subject of a lot of attention from cultural historians of dance music culture. And note, of course, though, there's also a lot of attention to Detroit techno, Chicago house, British or Ibiza acid house, Berlin techno, Goan psytrance, British jungle and drum and bass. And notice how essential geography is to the definitions and self-definitions of these scenes. It's absolutely critical to the geography side of things, and I'll show you a little bit more how in the New York case. So the claims about New York City in the 70s and how they gel with this utopian myth is that there are a range of new aesthetics that emerge through these disco scenes. Okay, and there's aesthetics of sound, which are a whole other conversation we could speak about, but then there's also the aesthetics of dance, the actual visual but also material, bodily, corporeal experience and spatiality of being on dance floors, and how different this was said to be in these underground disco scenes from what had preceded them and what was going on around them. For example, the idea that the means of dancing and the styles of dancing permitted non-normative expressions of sexuality, but not only sexuality, which is what people linked dance floors with before, but also sensuality in the broader sense. It wasn't just about sex. And about intimacy and broadening definitions of intimacy on dance floors with total strangers, right? This was a big part of the rhetoric and of the experience. And of course, as part of this, that the dancing was non-choreographed, not predetermined, it was independent, you didn't need a partner to dance with. And you know, one could argue, of course, that this started earlier with the traditions of the twist and things like that, but in many senses that, well, you weren't quite freed from your partner just yet in these dance forms, whereas disco was arguably the first moment where you could dance entirely as a free-flowing individual agent. This is what's frequently said about it. And of course, you know, the traditional ideas of accepted heterosexual courtship on dance floors was hugely challenged in these spaces as well, and frankly, completely rejected in many ways. So yeah, following the feel of the music with the dance style was a really big part of this. But apart from the aesthetics that this city scene was offering at this time, was that there was this idea that these were spaces of escape for marginalized people. So you had the backdrop of gay liberation movements and civil rights fueling changes in society, but mainstream society hadn't quite caught on fully yet. And there was still a lot of spaces that were very unsafe for queer people and very unsafe for people of color. And these kinds of spaces were not only a safe haven for people who didn't fit into the mainstream mold, but also allowed them to celebrate their identities and have a kind of sense of solidarity with each other. So this was a really, really big political underpinning of the scene. Okay, it's really, really important. And the other thing about the New York sort of city narrative is that people talk about the specificity and the uniqueness of that particular city at that particular time, the conditions that were just right in all of the different ways to form a particular scene like this, i.e. that this couldn't have happened anywhere else because the conditions wouldn't have been as they were there. So for example, that there had to be venues that were able to kind of get away with not being noticed by the law or being overlooked by the law, underground spaces that were unlicensed, you know, not real clubs, but just rooms that were being used for dancing, that New York had a unique urban geography. For example, that there was a kind of alchemy where everything fell into place with the right people who had the right political views and interests. For example, apparently there were lots of people in New York at the time in the 70s who were interested in Italian futurism and neo-Marxism and post-Marxism. And these combinations of things were the only possible way that the scene could have been how it was. And yet this changed dramatically, and this showed the time contingency of this. This changed dramatically with the new local municipal government in the 90s, where police crackdowns and rising property prices made such spaces completely inaccessible, and spaces that were torn down often for redevelopment. So these are some stories about and histories about New York and what made disco possible and what made it what it was. And those narratives, as city-specific, historically specific and unique as they are, have nevertheless dominated scholarly, journalistic and popular discourses on all types of DJ-based dance music cultures since then. Okay, so the following assumptions are widely held and reinforced from that New York scene, that DJ and dance music culture is a source of liberation for marginalized peoples, that the Rave motto of plur, peace, love, unity, and respect is upheld in dance music spaces, that the combinations of musical aesthetics, the dancing aesthetics, the sociality and community, the histories and queer ethnic others, makes it exceptional, dance music culture overall, exceptional compared with mainstream musical cultures and politics. and nightlife. And that there was once a golden age of dance music whose definition rests on usually what as a genre the person writing about it is most into. And there now no longer is such a golden age because the scene has become commercialized, globalized, whitewashed, etc. Okay. So, I'm going to take us with some perspectives from my research until 1, and I was told I had until 1, so then we'll have 10 minutes for question time, okay? Here are some realities. Now, I wasn't in New York for the disco scenes, but there are certain ways in which that gives me an advantage when thinking about this as a bigger problem of writing in a scholarly way about particular musical culture. Because it is certainly not always the case in the scenes that I've explored that we have sexual liberation, because what actually goes on constantly everywhere is a lot of sexual harassment on dance floors, which is something that's come to light more and more in recent years. We have people being profiled for their race, gender, or class and discriminated against. So for example, some things that have come up, you see sort of signs like that at mainstream clubs, or even actually not only at mainstream clubs sometimes. This idea that it's a kind of weird sense of like flipped positive discrimination, but for totally the wrong reasons. You have this notion from one of my participants in the Edinburgh scene that girls on a hen night, i.e. women coming to dance in a group, are somehow threatening to the social order of an alternative dance music space. Right? They might be wearing the wrong clothes, they might be dancing to they're used to dancing to the wrong music. There's this idea that they can't fit in. There's also a hugely classist idea associated with women going out on pre-bridal parties together to events that are largely male-dominated spaces. And these parties, like Dom in Edinburgh considers himself, forward-thinking, progressively political, fellow, but he was making all of these comments which are sexist and classist about the types of people who he deems acceptable to come to his club nights. And these are not the ones, right? Women on a hen night are not cool. So those types of discrimination are rampant. You have gender prejudice also about the musical sounds, which is sounding very strange probably, but here's some examples. In a lot of my research, we come up with the idea of fluffy sound as being a sound in electronics that women are attracted to on dance floors. So a lot of male DJs will say, yeah, if I want the girls to get dancing, I have to play some fluffy sounds. And they have come to an idea of what the aesthetic of fluffiness is. And it's very interesting because as someone who was in the scene myself, I sort of had an automatic understanding of what that meant. But as a researcher, I asked them specifically, could they tell me, what do you mean by fluffy sounds? And we came to some very interesting metaphors, okay, which are associated with a very, very enlightenment 18th century idea of binary feminine and masculine aesthetics. What we come to is, things that are of no substance, right? Fluffiness, things that are light and kind of fun but have no particular weight. These, fur, fluff, cotton candy, feathers, things that float. This was this kind of feminine aesthetic that people kept coming back to when it came to electronic sounds that got women to dance. Other than vocals, which was always the other bias, that if you play something with vocals, women would dance. This was something that also came up over and over again. Men are not the only ones that say this. Women totally bought into this. One of my DJ interviewees from Malmö talked about how she won't play girly house music. And this was interesting to me because she was constantly talking about how she was fighting to be legitimized in her scene. And so the technique or the way of managing this for a lot of women is that they avoid playing what they deem to be feminine music in order to be seen as acceptable. Okay? And they therefore have to share this aesthetic understanding of what feminine and masculine sound actually is. Okay? And they do it. Then we also have gender prejudice at the DJ booths and in studios. I don't know how many of you have come across this meme, but I saw it in an Oslo-based DJ forum, which had women in it, but the men were the only ones kind of flowing this around and laughing at it and making a big joke about it. I was amazed at the silence of the women in the group when this went around. One of them actually might have also reinforced it with a joke herself. But I mean, of course, this is based on a particular minimum level of cultural knowledge across the board, which is that women don't know how to use cables, right? And this was in 2016 that I saw this going around. Yeah. And a well-known DJ who I interviewed called the Black Madonna was saying that it took a very long time before she was credited with making her own music, and Björk has talked about this a lot herself as well, right? That the idea is, you know, the guy you dated did it for you, or your brother, or you know, whoever it is, that there's no sense of credit to the women who actually make music electronically themselves. Yeah, this is a very common trope. And this is also in alternative scenes, so it's not like a difference between mainstream and alternative culture. This is pervasive all overall. I can talk till the cows come home about the ways that technology contributes to the evil capitalist free market, but we'll probably skip over that for now because it will take a long time. But needless to say that the equipment that we use as DJs, even if we're playing in an ostensibly socially progressive scene, is contributing to social inequality in a very, very fundamental way that is very hard to escape from. Starting from the factories that dump industrial waste into people's rivers, okay? And this is all about consumer electronics, by the way, not just music. And then, of course, the technology itself is a tool of gender discrimination. We see it sometimes as a tool of, you know, utopian emancipation from the traditional shackles of musical instrument divisions, or the traditional historical biological realities of masculinity and femininity. But actually, we see the same things happening over and over again with the idea of marketing. So historically, the hi-fi system, the reason why we started to associate hi-fi with men in the domestic private sphere was because this is precisely what the companies who were selling hi-fi were promoting. They were saying, hey, guys, you can escape your wives and children and go into your man cave. This is actually where the idea of the man cave partly comes from, is marketing from hi-fi companies. And you can go and listen to your fantastic sound system, which we're going to charge you a huge amount for, and be in your own separate room and kind of run away from the horrible domestic existence that you have with your women, the feminized side of your life. So marketing is a huge reason for why we see technologies as being masculine, actually, more powerful than we realize. And this marketing was happening in the 50s already, for example. But there's also the fact that we have the terminology still in a lot of our technology, both in electronic worlds, in music, and also in computer worlds, that is violent and very masculinist if you look carefully at those words and what they symbolize and the fact that we still use them. This is not insignificant, okay? These contribute to this overall sense of this is a masculine space, a particular type of masculine space, yeah? And then, overarchingly, we have seen how this has played into ideas about women being incompetent with DJ and production technologies. And this is despite the massive role in the development of electronic music that women have actually contributed to. So this is a beautiful image of Delia Derbyshire at the BBC Radiophonics Workshop, and there were so many female figures who were crucial to kind of forming electronic music history, and yet the histories and narratives and writing that we see about it almost exclusively outlines this as a masculine history, up until very recently. This has started to change. Okay, so there's the way we narrativize things, and there's the way that things have actually gone. Okay, and it's really important that we play a role in rewriting these histories. So to conclude, before a couple of little question times. Dance music is ordinary. When Me Too happened and the music industry, including club scenes, started to uncover similar atrocities to the film industry, one of the most common things I heard was, we in dance music culture, especially alternative dance music culture, should be beyond this. Our scene should know better, for shame. Well, yes and no. I think I would rather hear, we as people should know better. Humanity should be better. Because I think it's a mistake to see club music or any other musical culture as a scene that is somehow separated from and somehow superior to, or underneath, in the sense of underground, the rest of everyday life in society. Like other aspects of life, dance music culture has its ups and downs. In that sense, it is not special and has no claims to being somehow beyond the realities of everyday culture. It's wrapped up in everyday culture. But just because it's ordinary, it doesn't make it trivial or insignificant. For the people who are involved in the scene, it has meaning. And this is the same for all musical and artistic cultures. And there is beauty in the ordinary. Just look at the passions of football fans. It would be a huge mistake to say that because football is an ordinary cultural phenomenon, that therefore it doesn't matter. Of course it does. Something that incites that degree of passion certainly matters. All I'm saying that is if we really want the scene to be as good as we say it is, our ethical imperative is not to shout from the rooftops repeatedly how good our scene is and pretend that bad things don't happen, but to actually make it so. So the utopian potential of dance music culture is real, but it is only in confronting the difficult realities of most dance floors, challenging the social inequalities that dance music technologies reproduce, and acknowledging that even special spaces can be host to everyday problems, that dance music might more consistently deliver on its offer of a better world. Thank you very much. And are there any questions?
We have time for some questions.
Thank you for your talk. I found it really interesting actually, and I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about your methodology and how you sort of use participants in your research, for example, because whilst I wholly agree with the fact that we have to confront these kind of narratives and these myths and you know, whose voice do we amplify, whose voice do we choose to amplify, it's not just the male voice, right? But I think that I'm also sort of just interested in how your methodology is confronting that problem as well, because you know, if you're basing this on field work, on sort of like covers, presumably your own experience, but other DJs, like what kind of things are you using to get that data?
Sure. In terms of the empirical work, it's interviews over the 8.5 years that I've been looking at the topic, and the interviews started off being non-gender specific, so I interviewed clubbers, DJs, producers, and like promoters as well of club events, so people who were just involved with the organisation of events. Most of my participants were male to begin with, and then over time when my project shifted, because I started to, well, when the participant observation element is a very informative one for me, because I was going in terms of the field work stuff as a clubber and as a DJ.
So were you recording in the club, for example? Were you interviewing people in the club, or were you waiting until a point afterwards?
Yeah, I generally didn't interview people in the club because it's a very kind of precious space in a way, and I didn't want to be obtrusive. The thing that I did was participate fully as whatever it was I was doing, whether it was DJing or clubbing. And occasionally I'd take notes on my phone. That's very, nondescript. Most people are on their phone at some point during a club night. And then I would go home and do a write-up, and I had a lot of participants who were involved with the scenes that I was attending, who were willing to speak to me outside club time, so just during the day. Yeah.
Do you know the researcher Christopher Sterling, who's based at Oxford?
I do.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And she's doing voice memos from the dance club.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting methodology. I was just wondering if you're doing something similar.
That is really interesting. Yeah. No, I wasn't quite as adventurous as that.
Okay.
In some respects, for me, the participant observation element was in many ways the most valuable, because those were the moments where my utopian mythologies were challenged.
Okay.
Because as a woman behind the DJ booth, I experienced all sorts of craziness that would be a whole other conversation. And as a woman on the dance floor, in many ways I was even more vulnerable. And also the safety of going to and from events is something that doesn't get discussed enough.
Yeah, so there's a scene that people want to be part of, but then they don't actually go because they don't feel safe to go, right? Especially if you're a woman.
Yeah, absolutely. So those participant observation things were what made me think on a more conceptual and theoretical level about how the literature doesn't address the experiences of people who haven't managed to reach that euphoric space. Because you can aim for that euphoria, but if you're a body that gets that euphoria interfered with all the time, you're never going to get there. So it's very easy for a white heterosexual presenting man to write about how he's gotten to this euphoric space because nobody's ever interrupted it. Yeah. So these are one of the ways I got there.
So based on what I was talking about earlier, about criticism, I'm a little bit curious if you also, it's not a hugely practiced genre, but I think it's the few times I do read, I think like reviews of club nights are super fascinating reading, I think.
Yeah.
Do you consider any of that in your research at all? Because I think it might be very kind of illuminating for a lot of, or like the continued expression of the utopian myth, I would imagine.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I've definitely, I guess you could say that I do look a lot at media and media descriptions of dance music events and dance music spaces and DJs, and especially at the kind of music criticism that goes on in high-end kind of journalistic media such as the Wall Street Journal, which I find really fascinating because they're doing a lot of reinforcing of high-low cultural distinction in their kind of assessments of, you know, everything that is wrong with contemporary EDM culture, for example, comes up with a lot of times. I suppose that's also because they're based in the US, so they see the biggest versions of that. But yeah, I do look at media a lot, and I look at the ways that social media interactions fulfill these kinds of ideologies and reinforce them, and the ways that DJs themselves work very, very hard in the promotion of themselves to play into that ideology. There's all sorts of examples of, you know, underground DJs who are absolutely full on in the corporate marketing, but do it in a way that allows people to buy into the ideology at the same time as buying into the brand. So yeah, absolutely. Good question.
Are you familiar with Jeremy Diller's latest film?
Yeah. Jeremy, whose latest
Jeremy
film?
Diller.
I don't
British
know.
artist. His latest film it's called An Incomplete History of Britain from 84 to 92, and it deals directly with the Rave culture in UK.
I don't know that film. Thank you for the
You should
recommendation.
see it because he points to the sort of the social liberating qualities of the Rave culture in UK in the 80s.
Mm-hmm. Good tip. Thank you.
It would be another lecture to go to sort of assess his points with yours, but I think it would probably be interesting.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'll definitely.
I think it's actually been screened on Christmas.
Yes, it was working a screen
Yeah.
the other day.
Yeah, I saw it on Thursday.
Yeah, so.
Thanks.
Okay, it's lunchtime. Oh, no, sorry.
It's just an observation, I think, but because you talked about the celebratory, the academic, but I think I want to turn that around a little bit because I think there is definitely a place for the what you might call the fan academic, because they have a very unique. They're obsessed, but they're also distanced, and they have this bizarre style and a very distinctive methodology and even a writing style. They pay attention to different things that other people who are not fans pay attention to. I'm sorry, I just wondered if you wanted to reflect on that.
Sure.
And would you say that yourself, that are you still a fan or not?
I'm absolutely still a fan. Oh yes. Yes. So yeah, the obsession thing I fully relate to, of course. I guess what I would say is that in the case of the writing on dance music culture that I see, I don't find any of that distance, or almost any of that distance, and I think that's where the problem lies for me, is that there's nothing to distinguish the academic writing that comes from fans from other types of fan writing.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, what's your contribution? I mean, really, because you could be writing a blog in fancy words and end up with the same arguments as the person writing this scholarly piece, but they're using high philosophy to express their ideas, right? So for me, I think, yes, of course, there were some benefits in terms of the content of what I was able to provide insights to, because I was an insider in a particular kind of way. But I actually worked very hard to not allow that to affect my conclusions. Okay, so one can use it to one's advantage, but I think the problem lies when that distancing doesn't occur at all. And all that you get is a reinforcement of kind of a recycling of ideas that are, our scene is wonderful. And one thing I didn't mention about that is that there is a history that comes from defending popular music writing from high art writing institutionally. So that there's a reason why a lot of popular music writers in scholarship are fans historically, and that's a very sound political history, and there was a place for that. But I feel like we are well beyond that, and I feel like we need to do more at this point. That's my impression of that. Thank you for your question.
Don't you think the use of the fan issue is being a fan is kind of a condition for sort of picking the sensibility or having the sensibility to understand the.
No, this is where I think that we're misguided about fandom. I think fandom can do certain things, but I actually think it's more of a disadvantage than an advantage when it comes to making. Yeah, when it comes to evaluating an object of study, you know, I'm so expressly not going to study something that I'm passionate about next. I'm going to be in my personal life. I'm going to study something I'm very interested in a scholarly sense, but that I know nothing about, because I really, really feel like it's been a disadvantage. I actually look at scholars who are researching music they hate, and what comes out of that is much more interesting to me. Actually, I mean, one could call that a certain type of passion too. Reverse type of
You
passion.
can't avoid positionality whether you like it or you don't. I mean,
Adorno hated jazz and didn't come.
This is true. You can't avoid positionality. That's absolutely true. I see absolutely what you're saying there. So I'm not purporting to say that I'm going to be going in as a blank canvas, as it were. But I think that the fan, the positionality of the fan has a particular type of baggage which is very difficult to escape from.
You got to conclude there. We're eating your lunch.
Yeah, sorry guys. Thank you very much for coming.